Welcome to Never Rewrites. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman. And today we're going to discuss the idea that you can believe in unit tests and also believe that skipping them can make you deliver faster. And
Controversial.
for context, I don't believe this, and I
Okay,
suspect Isaac you don't believe it either.
maybe.
Maybe. But I have encountered in my 20 odd years of programming, it is a consistent theme that managers who believe in unit testing. They believe in testing and they believe in unit tests and they believe in all these things. They believe it adds value and it's it makes the code better and then you can refactor it better. When push comes to shove, they will also believe that you can skip the unit tests and come back to them later because they have a deadline that they need to hit.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely run into that. I don't know if you have any more thoughts before I go into.
No, go into
So,
it.
okay. Um, I, it is kind of a weird thing, right? Because you hear everyone say, "Okay, testing is great. You should always
Mm-hmm.
write tests." Some people are pushed for TDD. Other people say, let's just write the test after we write the code." But in general, you usually have a consensus that tests are good and kind of required to be considered a professional. And on the flip side, I've definitely heard people want to push testing or put it on the wayside in favor of hitting a deadline. So I actually I don't necessarily think those ideas are at odds with each other.
Oh, no?
Interestingly, no.
Go on.
I think it depends on where you're at in the life cycle of your product and the sensitivity of the product that you're working on. For example, some companies have really great, well defined projects, and they know exactly what they're going to build and why they're going to build it and who they're going to build it for,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in those cases, you have so much stuff outlined for you that you actually could even do the TDD approach, let alone just testing the TDD approach of I know how this should behave, therefore I can write the test first, then write the, the code to do what the test is supposed to do, or to match what the test's assertions are essentially. So when you have products that are defined that well, you can do that. But a lot of times you have a loose idea of how you want something to behave.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you write the test first, or write tests in general, or like just go ahead and like write the like rather even if you're writing the feature first and adding the test to it,
Mm-hmm.
it might change a ton because you
Yeah.
don't really know what you're doing. So in the well defined area, you don't have to worry about that as much because I think in that approach, the unit test will help you write things faster because you know what you're writing to begin with. Whereas if you're doing something that's like speculative or you kind of have an idea how it should work, but you want to flesh it out and like kind of program by like what I call throwing paint on the canvas to see, how should this resolve? And I think it should work this way, but midway through it, okay, we can't actually use that module or that plugin. We have to pivot to this one. So, scrap that idea. That was a good idea. Because sometimes you have projects that flow that way where you're not going to be that well defined.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the team that you're on, or the company you're at, and the maturity and all that kinds of stuff. And in those cases, if you write unit tests for every little thing you do, and every day you kind of like keep changing directions and you keep rewriting the code and rewriting the tests, in those cases it might be better just to go ahead and write what you think it should be, and then once you're pretty sure, okay, yeah, okay, this is how I think it should behave, then start writing all the stuff that's going to kind of lock the functionality into place now that you know what you want essentially.
Interesting. This is a rare case where I think I completely disagree with you.
Good.
Uh,
All right, tell me more.
so, from my point of view, the tests become more valuable over time. So, if I'm going to write something and I'm never and I'm going to do UAT manually, right? If I'm never going to change it again, then I don't need the tests. And so, in a case where I'm writing a shell script or something to do, to munge something, and I need to run it once, and I'm going to test it as I go, and then it'll run, and then it'll be fine. And I'm never going to run it again. Maybe I don't need the tests at all. But when I don't know what I'm doing or where I'm going particularly, I find that the tests become more valuable because the more I'm changing things around, the less confidence I have that when I tested it previously manually, that it still works that way. And so when I'm trying to hit a deadline,
Hmm.
it's not that the unit tests, like if I'm writing a piece of code, and I think this is true of most good developers, I can write a piece of code, and if I didn't write the tests, I could manually test it, and it would probably be about almost as fast. If I knew what I was going to write and I was going to go, just increment, just step through it, like, okay, I'm going to do this piece, then this piece, and this piece, and I more or less have an idea of what it is, and I want to save time, so I'm not going to write the tests, and I'm just going to test it once manually and move on. If I'm not rewriting any of that code, then I think you could get away with it. It could be faster. But the less I know about where I'm going, the more valuable those tests become. Because then I don't need to retest. And like this bit me last week even, where I was using something that I wasn't super familiar with. I was using a Symfony component to do my parameter validation. And it was my first rodeo with that. And so I had a parameter and I was checking that it wasn't empty. And then I switched it to check that it was a date. In Symfony, date doesn't check that it's not empty. It'll just explode. It'll throw an exception. So you need both.
Okay.
And so what happened is I wrote it to confirm that there was a value, and then I changed and tested it, and then I wrote it, and then I changed it to confirm that it was a date and tested it. But now it no longer worked that there was a value, and I did not go back and retest it manually. And then later at the end, basically after I noticed in the demo that I had made a mistake somewhere, I wrote the test. Because then and this is just a case of me changing validations in 2 minutes, and it would have been easier, better, if I had written the test first, or as I'd gone along. Apologies to the TDD crowd, I never write my tests first. I write the function, and then I write a test to confirm that the function works the way I think it should.
Do you have anything more to say on that? I guess I was just going to kind of. I don't disagree with your method, and I guess my only defense on it being another it depends essentially. And well, first of all, I like writing tests no matter what. I love testing. I find it very fun. So my only caveat, like the only reason I'm vouching for this other kind of flow is I've seen other people who are really slow at tests, or don't know testing frameworks very well, especially if you're speculating a brand new, like I know PHP unit tests and jest tests. What if we were going to write something in Python? I don't know the Python testing very well. I don't know Java testing very well because I don't write in those languages very frequently. So I've seen cases where people can write code very fast to get understanding of like how they want the behavior to be, and they're slower at testing. And because they're slower at testing, they're slower at changing the code in the test over and over and over again on a very uncertain feature. And so that can hit a deadline. Like if it is a perfect world where everyone knows their testing framework well and they're fast at it, then testing will always be a better solution. I just think it depends on what you're building, who you're building it with, what other people's experience with testing is. I always advocate for tests, but I'll give you an example. Recently, we're building an API, and an API that we're working on now, people were just not really writing tests for it. And I was kind of at first kind of annoyed because I thought, if you're building a brand new API, you may as well go ahead and start writing tests. But I just kind of let it be because people were still discussing and shifting so much of the code, so much of the ideas were changing, that they were kind of like basically just destroying modules they built and the tests along with it, or for the ones that they did write tests for. And they were doing this shuffle back and forth so much that it was just a lot of I guess I understood why they didn't write the test for it because they didn't really know what they were doing yet. They're just like, oh, should it work this way? Should it work that way? back and forth. Um, so I just didn't say anything for a bit. And then later I looked and saw our code coverage and it was pretty terrible. For a brand new project, it was like 20%. And then so what I did was over the weekend, I just spent 5 hours and I wrote tests for everything. No
Okay.
big deal. Wrote tests for something that was basically had been being built for a few months. And, they were able to build it very fast, so fast, way faster than they could with tests. Because I guess, I don't really know why they didn't want to write the test.
But did it have a lot of problems? Like, so they wrote something with no tests, they put it in production. You said months, so they didn't
No
go into
production.
production.
No. This is we didn't know. We were still trying to figure out how all the functionality should work. It was like, should we have an input for that? Should we design it this way? Should we use GraphQL? Should we use REST? All these decisions playing around with a brand new NPM project. And so we could write a ton of tests for it and then go, never mind, we're not going to do that, and just delete all the tests. And so it takes, not a non-trivial amount of time to write tests, if you want to be thorough and catch all your branches. And if you're going to keep destroying the test because you keep changing what you want,
Yes.
you're wasting time, right? That's my
maybe. Hey.
And writing the tests after we finally decided what we wanted from everything, writing the test was super easy. The code was well structured, went in, slapped all the tests. Now it has 98% test coverage, and it took less than a day to add all the tests. And I think it would be a lot easier in some cases for someone to come through and write the tests. I think from going forward, once the things mature, now we went ahead and locked in and at it. It can't go less than like 93% code coverage, or the pipeline will fail. Now that we're pretty good, now we would know this is how we want it to behave. Let's put some standards in place. Everyone has to have a test in their PR now because this is stable. And I think that worked really well in this project. I don't advocate for doing that in every project or in any project I would have control over. I want to write the test with everything anyway. But it worked really well in this particular case, and that's the only reason I'm advocating for it. It depends.
Well, it's an interesting case that you're describing because it sounds like the project was in a like it was work in progress state.
Exactly.
And that you added tests once it got into production.
Well, it's not in production still. It's still staging. Yeah.
Oh, it's still in staging. Because to me, in my head, one of the things is that tests become more valuable over time. Like a test you write today is more valuable 6 months from now because you have no idea what you wrote when. Then, if I wrote a test today and I'm going to refactor tomorrow, the test is less valuable.
Yeah, I still think it depends. I agree with you almost 100% of the time, but I think there's so much in this particular case. There was so much code shifting so quickly that the tests were changing dramatically. It was basically a rewrite of the test, right? So it wasn't like a small thing where it's locking in functionality for the most part. It was like, no, let's move all the folders. We're gonna should it live over here? Should it live over there? Should we rename it here? Should we strongly type this particular thing? Oh no, let's use DTOs instead of passing these typed interfaces. Just a ton of things that we would have spent so much overhead rewriting tests for. That I think in this particular case, it actually worked out pretty well doing it this way. And again, I'm not a believer in doing it this way. I was just very surprised that it was so easy to get close to 100% coverage in less than like a day after we finally locked things into place. Because I was like, you should always write tests. But in this case, I was like, they were very fast in getting it up. And, it didn't really hurt us in this case.
It sounds like in this case, most of the code got thrown away. Like, you're describing a case where the iterations, if you had, say, 1,000 lines, you might have changed 900 of them 10 times, but it never expanded. It was still only 1,000 lines.
Yeah, there was a lot of churn in like how we thought something should behave, or if we should go this route. It was very much a living project because we were like, no one had built anything in this platform before, and the thing that we were trying to extract, we were trying to extract like DC ship, we're not DC ship, but iteratively deliver some pieces of an old monolith into this new one. And so there was a lot of speculation on what's the clean standards, or hey, we're going to do it this way. Well, actually, this framework prefers you do it their way. Oh, okay. Well, what does that look like? Let's install that module. And there was a lot of shuffle back and forth. And so I think in that case, until you really know and you're finalizing what you actually want out of something, it might be okay sometimes to add the test, as long as you still add the test before you go to production. Don't go to production yet without the test.
Well,
But
that's
lock
an
in your
interesting
function,
thing.
lock in how you want it to behave. But I think in this case, it was, I'm fine with it. No, I don't feel bad.
No, I mean, it's an interesting case where if you're going to churn the same code over and over again, then the value of writing the tests you're saying diminished. Where in my mind we were, because I was imagining a structure where I'm going to write a piece of code and then I'm going to write the next module and the next module and the next module. And
In
this
that
is I'm going
case,
to
I
write
agree.
the first module. I'm going to change the framework. I'm going to redo the module. I'm going to redo the module. I'm going to redo the module.
For example, if you spin up something in React, and then you go, oh well, maybe we should change. Actually, we have a ton of people here who are Angular experts or whatever, or Ember experts. Let's shift it. Then you're gonna have to like port over all those tests to be a new framework or a new module or a new lifecycle system for
Mm-hmm.
use effect. This one versus like the Ember lifecycle hooks that they use. You've written all these tests to assert use effect, which doesn't exist in this framework because you're still trying to figure out what you want it to do and what framework you want to use. Oh, actually, we started building this one, but this one's really great for small APIs. Let's switch to that one. You
Hmm.
know, and that's the case I'm getting at here. Your case, it sounds like you're building something you know what you want it to do. You know exactly the framework you want it, how the framework should perform, and you already have requirements over how each thing should behave. And in my case, it's almost like you're still brainstorming an idea. It's still living, so there's no need to lock in functionality that you don't know should behave that way yet. You're still playing around with should it behave that way. So the test is supposed to lock in that functionality so it always behaves that way, but your behavior is in flux because you don't really like quite know what you want out of it yet. And I think in that case, it's okay to be a little flexible.
Interesting. All right, I see your argument.
I still don't advocate for it. If you're listening to this, I still think 99.9% of the time you should always write tests with your code.
Right. I mean,
But this
this
is cool. Yeah,
screams to me a very specific case where,
yeah.
and I think the TDD folks or the extreme programming folks have a term for this that I am
Mm,
blanking on, where it's an exploratory branch,
yeah.
and there's a good chance that they wouldn't even commit it. They would just say, oh well, this is not a good thing. I'm just going to drop the branch and go back to main and start again. And so
That's
then
a
of
really,
course
yeah.
you
That's an
wouldn't
interesting
have.
way to phrase it. Like if you're playing around with something, why write tests? Until you know that you want this to actually be something people use, just muck around with it. If I'm
Mhm.
going, well, I wonder if I can hit Chat GPT and make it do that. I don't need to write tests over all of my requests to their API because I might just toss the code tomorrow, and that's just wasted time. But
Yeah,
it can
don't.
lead to bad practice if you keep that behavior wherever you go. You always want to. The moment a customer is going to see it, you should have over 85% test coverage. Is my motto. There's no reason not to. But if you're just playing around with something only you're going to see, who cares?
Right. It's when it makes that switch from something that only you will ever see to something that you actually are going to use.
Yeah. Like
That's
even still, if you had something you wanted to play around with tonight, like a different framework that you wanted to see how like the endpoints worked or how the lifecycle hooks worked, you would just muck around with the code and go, "Oh, that's interesting." You probably wouldn't like every little thing you did write tests to make sure that it worked the same way the next time because you're still playing around with it.
right. Well, the goal would be different. The goal wouldn't be to
Yeah.
produce code, it would be to learn.
Yes, exactly. So I think in those cases, and this was a mixture because the
Hmm.
goal for us was still to produce code and it was still to eventually hit the customer. It was just like, hmm, are the company's shifting? Some people wanted it in PHP, some people wanted it in JavaScript. JavaScript seemed easier to hire for. So one person actually built a proof of concept in Laravel, the other person was like built a proof of concept in Nest, and it was just like a lot of playing around. And we were about to throw away the Laravel code, and that would have really sucked if we wrote tests for the Laravel code for all those endpoints, and we were still trying to figure out what the best solution would be because it's not necessarily just a technical decision; it's like also like a business decision. What's
Hmm.
easier to hire for? Does everyone know PHP as well as I do? If everyone else knows, if half your developers know PHP, but all of them know TypeScript, maybe you should build your product in TypeScript. You know,
I am very very much on the practical side.
Yeah. So again, like I keep having to asterisk it with like this is a very strange edge case. You should never really I love writing tests, and I will always write tests where it makes sense when people see the code. But
Mhm.
in this particular case, I was very surprised at how trivial it was once we realized, okay, this looks like we're about to get ready for a beta release and maybe push to prod in a month or so. Let's slap some tests on it now and lock in all the functionality. We don't think it's going to shift a lot more than what it currently looks like, and we did it, and it's fine.
Nice. So I guess we're saying skipping the test to release fat to hit a deadline can only work if you don't exactly know, if you have very little idea of what you're trying to build in the first place. Like
Or you're still playing around with like
well,
what
you're throwing things at the
modules.
wall to see what
Yeah.
sticks, kind of a thing. You're not
Right.
You're not building. You don't know exactly what you're building.
Yeah. Or you don't know the behaviors quite yet. You know that we knew we're building an API.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know quite how the API would be structured. If it was a REST API, a GraphQL, how the REST endpoints are structured. Still kind of, still having like living discussions around what would be the most useful at the company with the knowledge base that we have and the employees that are here.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it before we test the audience patience. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.